What if the thing you fear most, being alone, is the very thing that could heal you? We run from silence. We fill our days with noise, our minds with distractions, our hearts with attachments. But the monk knew something most of us forget, that solitude is not absence, it is presence. The presence of clarity, of truth, of self. He didn't escape the world to be lonely. He stepped back to hear what the world kept drowning out, his own soul. This is where our story begins, not with a crowded room, but with a quiet walk, a still morning, and a man who learned that being alone was not a punishment, but a path. The monk didn't always love solitude. At first, it scared him. The silence felt loud. The space felt empty. His thoughts, unfiltered, sharp, chaotic. But he stayed. And in the staying, something softened. He noticed the rustling of leaves, the rhythm of his breath, the way his mind began to quiet. Not because he forced it, but because it finally had room. In solitude, nothing distracted him from himself. And that's when he saw it. How much of his life had been lived for others. To impress, to belong, to be needed. But none of those things ever made him feel whole. Only stillness did. One morning, sitting beside a still pond, the monk watched the ripples fade. No wind, no sound, just presence. And he realized, this quiet was not empty. It was full of awareness, full of peace, full of himself, finally heard. He smiled, not because something grand had happened, but because nothing was pulling him away anymore. Solitude had become his teacher, not in words, but in space. And if these words are reaching something deep in you, perhaps it's time to sit with yourself more often. And if you're walking this same quiet path, consider subscribing and tapping the bell so you don't miss the stillness waiting in the next lesson. Before the monk embraced solitude, he chased company, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of missing out, fear of being forgotten, fear of what he might find if left alone with his own thoughts. But he learned, company without connection is lonelier than silence. He had once surrounded himself with people who talked loud, but never listened, with noise that filled the air, but left his soul hollow. So he chose something different, not because he hated others, but because he finally loved himself enough to enjoy his own company. And in that space, he found what the world couldn't give him: presence without pressure, peace without performance, a life that felt like his. Solitude didn't remove pain, it revealed it. The monk once believed quiet meant peace, but in the silence, old wounds surfaced, regrets echoed, emotions once ignored rose like waves. He wanted to run, back to distraction, back to noise. But instead, he stayed. Because healing doesn't happen in avoidance. It happens in attention. And slowly, as the days passed, his pain softened. Not because it vanished, but because it was finally held without judgment. In solitude, he became his own witness, his own comfort, his own companion. And that changed everything. The world teaches us to stay busy, to keep moving, to prove our worth through productivity. But the monk learned, there is no wisdom in constant motion, only exhaustion. He once believed that stillness was laziness, but in solitude, he discovered the truth, that silence is not the absence of doing, but the presence of being. In the quiet, he saw more. He felt more. He became more aware of his breath, his thoughts, his choices. Solitude wasn't an escape. It was a return to the place where nothing needed to be earned and everything could simply be. And in that sacred simplicity, he found something rare, a joy not tied to success, a peace not dependent on anyone else. There was a time when the monk mistook solitude for loneliness, when silence felt like absence, when no one around meant something was missing. But in time, he began to see clearly. Loneliness is the ache of not being known, even in a crowded room. Solitude is the comfort of knowing yourself, even when no one else is around. He used to seek connection to feel alive, but now he understood. Real connection doesn't start with others. It begins with self. And when you know who you are, when you enjoy your own presence, you no longer chase half-hearted company just to fill a silence that isn't empty. Because solitude, when embraced, becomes a sanctuary, not a sentence. The monk noticed something curious. When he was surrounded by noise, he couldn't hear his own thoughts. But when he stepped into solitude, his thoughts became louder, not to harm him, but to guide him. There were memories he'd buried, questions he'd avoided, truths he'd softened for the comfort of others. Now, in the silence, they returned, not as enemies, but as teachers. He realized he had spent so much of his life seeking answers from others, mentors, books, voices in crowded halls. But the deepest answers were always quiet, and they never shouted. They waited for a space wide enough to be heard. That space was solitude, and in it, he began to understand things he never had time to feel. There was a shift the monk didn't notice at first, but over time it became clear. He was no longer triggered by the world in the same way. The judgment of others no longer pierced his peace. The rush of comparison no longer stirred his restlessness. Not because the world had changed, but because he had rooted himself in something deeper than approval. He saw how people ran from silence into distractions, into performance, into noise. But he had learned that silence isn't something to escape. It's something to trust. Because when everything falls away, what remains isn't emptiness, it's essence. And he was no longer afraid of what he found there. He was finally home within himself. The monk began to see that solitude wasn't only a retreat, it was preparation. Each silent morning wasn't about escaping life, but meeting it more clearly. The stillness showed him which emotions were truly his, and which were inherited, which desires came from the soul, and which from the noise of the world. Without the constant pull of others, he could finally choose with clarity. He didn't need to please. He didn't need to impress. He only needed to align. So when he returned to the world, he did not return as a seeker. He returned as one who had already found what the world was searching for. A peace that could not be sold. A freedom that didn't depend on agreement. A life that belonged entirely to him. People often asked the monk, "Don't you get lonely?" He would smile, gently, and reply, "Not when I'm with myself." Because he understood something most never paused to consider, that being alone and being lonely are not the same. Loneliness is craving others to distract you from yourself. Solitude is being with yourself and feeling whole. The monk found joy in the stillness. He laughed at memories without needing someone to hear. He cried and let it pass like clouds across a quiet sky. And in those moments, he met the most important person in his life, his own soul. Not through words, not through effort, but through presence. Solitude gave the monk space to see himself clearly. Not the roles he played, not the masks he wore, but the being underneath. Without the expectations of others, he was free to notice his patterns. The way he would shrink in conflict. The way he sought approval without realizing it. And instead of judging it, he observed. Solitude wasn't about fixing himself. It was about meeting himself with honesty, with softness, with courage. He began to understand. He didn't need to be perfect to be present. He didn't need to be healed to be whole. He only needed to be here. And in that awareness, something powerful awakened. A sense of worth that wasn't earned. It simply was. The monk once believed he had to do something grand to change his life. A pilgrimage, a vow, a radical shift. But in solitude, he learned transformation is quiet. It happens when you sit still with what hurts, and don't run. when you watch your thoughts without attaching to them, when you feel your sadness without turning it into a story. He began to notice how his breath softened when he stopped trying to fix everything, how his heart slowed when he let go of what he couldn't control. Solitude wasn't dramatic. It was gentle, subtle, steady, but it moved him in ways no crowd ever could. The monk didn't isolate himself to escape the world. He stepped back to understand it, because when you're constantly in motion, you forget to question what you're moving toward. In solitude, he saw it clearly. How much of his life had been shaped by noise he didn't choose. Beliefs handed down, fears absorbed from others, goals borrowed from a culture of comparison. But in the quiet, those voices faded, and what remained was his own. Small at first, like a whisper. But with attention, it grew. It told him he was enough, even when he wasn't producing, even when no one was watching, even when he had nothing to prove. That voice, it became his compass, and solitude, his map. One afternoon, the monk sat beneath a tree. No task, no goal, just presence. And he realized something so simple it felt like a revelation. He didn't need to be anything more than what he already was. Not wiser, not stronger, not more enlightened. Just here, just breathing. Solitude had stripped away the constant need to improve, to impress, to become. And in its place, it left peace. The kind of peace that isn't found through striving, but through surrender. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't giving up. He was finally allowing himself to be whole without condition. And in that moment, he wasn't missing anything, because he was no longer missing himself. Solitude gave the monk space to unlearn, to let go of the noise he mistook for truth, to release the pressures he once called purpose, to step away from the mirror of other people's eyes. He remembered how often he had shaped himself to be more likable, more agreeable, more useful. But in silence, those masks fell. He was no longer trying to be palatable. He was learning to be real. Not everyone would understand. Not everyone would stay. But for the first time, he wasn't bending to be kept. He was standing to be free. Solitude didn't ask him to perform. It invited him to rest, not to sleep, but to stop pretending. There was a shift the monk didn't notice at first, but over time, it became clear. He was no longer triggered by the world in the same way. The judgment of others no longer pierced his peace. The rush of comparison no longer stirred his restlessness, not because the world had changed, but because he had rooted himself in something deeper than approval. He saw how people ran from silence into distractions, into performance, into noise. But he had learned that silence isn't something to escape. It's something to trust. Because when everything falls away, what remains isn't emptiness. It's essence. And he was no longer afraid of what he found there. He was finally home within himself. The monk once asked himself a simple question. If no one could see me, no one could praise me, no one could validate me, who would I be? And in solitude, he found the answer. He would still sit with care, still move with intention, still offer kindness, not for reward, not for image, but because it was true. Solitude had stripped away the audience, and what remained was integrity. A life lived not for display, but for alignment. He no longer needed applause to feel alive, because his own breath, his own presence, his own clarity were enough. And in that enoughness, he found something priceless: freedom. There is a moment in solitude when something clicks. It's not dramatic. There's no lightning strike, just a quiet shift. The monk felt it as he watched the sunrise alone. For years, he had looked to others to reflect his worth. A glance, a compliment, a nod of approval. But now, he saw beauty, and didn't need to share it to feel it. He felt peace, and didn't need it validated. He existed, fully, gently, and without apology. Solitude had become more than space. It had become his rhythm. And in that rhythm, he no longer reacted. He responded. Not from fear, but from center. Not from lack, but from quiet fullness. You don't have to run away to find peace. You don't have to abandon life to feel free. Sometimes, all it takes is 5 minutes of solitude each day. A breath with your own soul. A pause without explanation. A moment that belongs only to you. The monk didn't seek solitude to be special. He chose it to remember, to return, to rebuild. And now, when the world pulls, he doesn't resist with force. He responds with stillness. Because when you know how to sit with yourself, you stop looking for others to carry you. And when you trust your own presence, you walk lighter, speak softer, and live deeper. So ask yourself, truthfully, what part of your life is asking for silence? And are you willing to listen? Share your reflection in the comments. You never know. Your words might be the silence someone else needed to hear.